اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters and friends, welcome to our weekly discussion on Fiqh al-Mu'amalat. We are reading al-Durr al-Mukhtar by Imam al-Huqq rahimahullah wa radiya an, and we left off on the discussion of Bay'ud Dain, and now the Musannif, he says rahimahullah, وفيها وفي الأشباه لا يجوز الاعتياض عن الحقوق المجردة كحق الشفعة. He begins to discuss the concept of huquq and taking compensation or fees for huquq, rights. Before we discuss the ibara and before we explain this paragraph, let us just look and contemplate on what huquq are. Because there's a spectrum of tradables in Shari'ah. Not everything in Shari'ah can be traded. Certain things can be sold, certain things cannot be sold. So the question arises, how do we determine and establish what can be traded against what can't be traded? What are the defining features? So in the beginning we spoke of mal, and Imam Huqq rahimahullah, he introduced the concept of mal. Okay, this what we call property, and what makes something property in Sharia. Then we spoke about the concept of manfa'ah briefly, very briefly, but we touched upon what services are. Then there was a discussion on dain just recently, debt, and how debts are just claims, and that's why they're not considered to be mal min kulli wajhin, rather they're mal hukmi, that in the eyes of the law, legally, dain and debt are considered property and wealth because it gives the creditor a right and claim to mal. That's why hukman, in the eyes of the law, it's considered to be mal. But now the discussion comes to huquq, because what are huquq? Huquq are towards, if you have a spectrum of tradables and exchangeables. On one side, if you have mal, then you have manfa'ah, you would then have huquq, right? You could have mal, then dain would come thereafter. So mal, then dain, then manfa'ah, then huquq, and then at the other side of the spectrum would be ma'adum, nothingness. Something which is ma'adum, there's nothing there. This is where items and tradables will sit on the spectrum. Either a tradable will be mal, either it will be mal hukmi, meaning dain, or it will be manfa'ah, or it will be huquq, or it will be nothingness. This is where everything will sit. It'll be one of these places that something will sit. And it all depends on its properties. So we understood what mal is in the initial sessions where we discussed mal. But let's zoom in on huquq. What are huquq? So huquq are simply rights. We translate huquq as rights. When we talk about huquq, what we're talking about is this idea of granting somebody an opportunity, exclusivity, the ability to do something. That's what a haqq is. So if you have the right to enter a place, you've been given permission to enter. The haqq that you have, the right that you have, is given you an authority, permission to enter into a particular place. It's a right. Now this right will be granted by somebody. So the classical Hanafi fuqaha, when the Hanafi fuqaha, they looked at tradables and exchanges, they always looked at, one, what is actually being traded, and then what is being transferred. Because there's many ways to understand something and dissect something. One is through the mahiyya of something, the actual essence of something. And then secondly is the thamarat and atharat, Fiqh revolves around these ideas of mahiyya and atharat. What's the mahiyya of this? What's the reality of this? What is this thing made of? And then what's the atharat? What's the thamarat? What are the consequences of this action? So bay, the fuqaha, when they philosophized over bay, they looked at the idea of, okay, what is bay? Bay has in its rukn ijab and qabul. It requires this exchange. But then this exchange has some atharat and thamarat, which is intiqal al-badalain, or intiqal milkiyat al-badalain, to kind of cause a transfer in ownership. That's when you understand the entire reality of something, when you know its features, its essence, and the functionality and the consequences of that thing. So the fuqaha used many a time these ideas to understand something, to understand the present and to understand the future, i.e. to understand its essence and to understand its consequence. So huquq is similar. When looking at mal, bay, huquq, all these things, we look at what a haqq is in and of itself, its mahiyya. And then we look at what are the consequences of trading maliyya or huquq. What's the consequences of trading a haqq? What are the outcomes? So the fuqaha, they looked at mal and they saw that, look, a mal is something which exists in and of itself. Mal is not dependent on anything else. It has its own body, its own existence. Now that body can be physical or digital. Tangibility nowadays is not a criterion for being mal. Just because something is not tangible, it does not mean it's not mal. So tangibility is not something which is a criterion or a core feature of being mal. Rather, it's this idea of being in existence independently of anything else. Now that existence can be physical, it can be digital, or it can be something which is intangible, but yet it has existence which is independent of everything else. Meaning that's why the fuqaha, when they described mal, they spoke of the idea وَيُمْكِنْ إِدِّخَارُهُ لِوَقْتِ الْحَاجَةِ. In the definition of mal, the fuqaha, when they defined mal, they defined it with this concept and notion of mal being retrievable at will. Whenever you need that mal, it's retrievable. It's not dependent or contingent on something else. And neither is it just existing for the sake of it. Rather, it has its own independence. It's not connected to anything else per se. It's not dependent on anything else. So a manfa'a, a service, the use of fruct of a property. If you're leasing a property, that lease, it is not stored. It can't be stored. It's not something which is stored. Rather, this lease will be used and consumed whilst you are living in the property. It doesn't have its own independent existence. Nobody can remove the use of fruct of the property independent from the property and then sell that manfa'a. It won't work. You can't do that. And that's why the scholars, when they spoke about mal, they made this distinction between that which is storable and that which is not storable, or that which is retrievable and that which is not retrievable, to distinguish between this idea that if something is not existing on its own and it has no existence in reality, a manfa'a has no real existence. Out of darura, in khilaf al-qiyas, the fuqaha have granted manafi' existence and wujud. But really, at the time of an act of ijara, it's ma'doom. The fuqaha discussed this, but because it's ma'aruf and it's been practiced upon, from very early days, it's accepted that use of fruct and service is something, although it cannot be seen, it cannot be engaged with. But we all experience it, we all value it, we all cherish it, we all benefit from it, and we are ready to pay for it. So ijara and the concept of manfa'a was something ma'doom, but we are just on the receiving end of it. And that's why the fuqaha, when they speak of ijara, they speak of this contract of being something which is typically khilaful qiyas, in the sense that bay and transactions require the subject matter to be existing and to be in existence. But up here, the mahal, the actual thing that's being traded and the actual thing that's being paid for is not existing. That's why the contract, daruratan, it's made on the property and the building. So if you're leasing a property, although you are actually leasing the space, the manfa'a in the property, the walls and the property belongs to the landlord. As a tenant, you are only leasing the space inside. But for the contract to be valid, because space, usufruct, the manfa'a is not defined. You can't define something which is invisible. How do you define it? So then you define it by something which captures the manfa'a. So the property, the four walls, the address, the time span, this brings definition to something which is invisible, intangible, and really non-existing. Nothing that we can grasp or see or perceive. So anyway, when the fuqaha spoke of mal, they spoke of this idea of iddikhar li waqti al-haja. And therefore, that's mal. Manfa is what we just discussed. Huquq is something completely different. Huquq gives the sahibul haqq, or the person who's been granted the haqq, the right to do something. But the issue with the right is it's something which, as I mentioned, is just something which exists in the kind of in the ownership of somebody. It's not something which is independently owned. Rather, it's on somebody's conscience, you could say. I've given you the right to do something. I have the authority. That's why the scholars talk about the person is sultah, the one with authority. He's a person with authority is granting you the right and the authority to do something. But he's not really transferring anything to you. Nothing is being granted to you. Rather, he's only allowing you to do something. Yes, there may be a paper, there may be a certificate, there may be some kind of document which shows you have a particular right. But that right is not something transferred to you. Rather, that right is simply me, in my conscience, I've permitted that for you. So haqq has no iddikhar. It's not something which is retrievable, storable. It's something I've given you the permission to do something. Because it's with me, I have authority over this space. I've allowed you, I've granted you permission. But it doesn't mean I've transferred something to you physically. Nothing's been transferred from the seller to you. It's just I've granted you something. I've kind of forgone my own rights to facilitate for you. So I've just given you permission. When you're granted permission to do something, there's no transfer of anything to you. Rather, it's the owner of the right, or the one with authority, allowing certain things for yourself. And therefore, when there is no transfer, it can't be called a bay and mubadala or mal. So you can't trade and transact in something which cannot be transferred. And that's the whole issue with huquq. That's why the Hanafi fuqaha, they distinguish between mal and huquq. They did not consider huquq in the original sense, which was huquq mujarrada or huquq mufrada, as mal. Yes, there was a discussion on certain huquq which were tabi', which were subordinate to and they were connected to amwal, like haqqul murur as an example, where a person, he had the right to walk in a particular path, and because this right was connected to an actual path, the scholars permitted the trade of that haqq tab'an to the land or to that path. You could trade that haqq because it was connected to a very specific ayn. So it was tabi' to that. However, you had things like haqqut ta'alli. Haqqut ta'alli referred to the idea of having the right to the space above a property. So can somebody exclude another, or can somebody purchase the right of the space above a property or above a particular area, that I have the right to this space, nobody can use this space or penetrate this space or exploit this space. This space is mine. I have the right to it. And the fuqaha did not recognize this because it was connected to something which was not mal, the hawa, the space, the air, and that's not mal, so it was haqq mujarrad. So scholars, when they talk about huquq mujarrad or huquq, they typically have two definitions or two kind of categorizations. They have haqq mujarrad and haqq ghair mujarrad. If it's ghair mujarrad, then it's that which is not, it's connected to, as I mentioned, an ain, and but it may not be specific to a particular person. Okay, the example I gave was of haqqul murur, and so typically in haqq ghair mujarrad, it's something which is established, firm, and it's connected to something. Whereas in haqq mujarrad, it's typically not connected to a right which is not connected to anything. It's a standalone right, you could say. The scholars have gone further when talking about huquq, and they've classified and discussed huquq in terms of where the haqq has been established from. And so the scholars mentioned huquq al-Shari'ah and huquq al-Urfiyah. Huquq al-Shari'ah refers to those huquq which the Shari'ah has granted. For example, shuf'a, wila, wiratha, haqq al-nasab, haqq al-qisas, khiyar al-aib, khiyar al-ru'ya. These are rights the Sharia has given. These are also huquq, types of huquq. When it comes to huquq al-Shari'ah, the rights that which Sharia have granted to people, there's two types of huquq then. So you could say a subtype of huquq Shari'ah. You have huquq al-daruriyah. Those huquq are which are established daruratan, meaning out of necessity. Why have they been established out of necessity? Because the Sharia has established these not as a right per se, but just to protect someone from harm, lidafi darar. The entire objective of these huquq is to protect the one with the right. An example is haqqu shuf'a. If a person is given haqqu shuf'a, they have the right to preempt a transaction, and they have the right to come and so if the property, for example, was sold to a neighbor and it wasn't offered to or sold to a third party and it wasn't offered to the partner in the property, he'll have haqqu shuf'a. He'll have the right to say that you should have offered this first to me, and he can raise his haqqu shuf'a, and he may then can get the right to purchase the property. This is to prevent harm reaching the partner, because somebody else might come and buy their shares in a property, and that person may not get along with the partner. He may have a completely different vision for the property than the partner, and this can, of course, create chaos and conflict between the two parties and partners. So this right is daruratan, established for daf' darar. The ruling of this is that it's not permissible to take a fee whatsoever, because if the person who is being potentially harmed, if he starts trading this, then clearly he's not being harmed, right? So if this right of his is being traded, and the only reason why this right was granted to him in the first place was to protect him from some harm, the premise of this right is to protect oneself from harm. If he's trading this elsewhere, then clearly there's no harm for that person, meaning that he's happy to trade it elsewhere. Secondly, the premise is protection from harm. When you are selling that to somebody else, that premise no longer stands, and therefore it's no longer a darura, because it's the entire reason why this person is the entire reason why the person is granted this right is to protect themselves from harm, and it's a darura, so it's a necessity for themselves. It's something to protect them. And so when something's a darura, it's not the same as something which is not a darura. So because this haqq is only established daruratan, when there is no darura, it's not established anymore. And therefore, if he's trading this and he's not exercising this right, then for him it's no longer a darura, and therefore he cannot trade. And that's why the Sharia speaks of such huquq that they cannot be traded at all. You can't take a fee from other people. And so that's the first type of huquq shar'iyya, first subtype. The second type of huquq shar'iyya is al-huquq al-asliyya. Those huquq which are established by default, right? Aslan, they're established. It's not there for the protection against harm or anything else. It's purely as a right which the person has for another reason. For example, حق القصاص, the person has right for qisas. حق الإرث, the right a person may have to inheritance. The Sharia has granted these rights to a person with a specific sifa, bisifatin makhsusa, with a specific attributes and characteristics and reasons. And whenever this sifa and these characteristics are no longer found, this haqq will no longer be found. So a person who has a right to receive inheritance does so because of certain attributes the person possesses and the characteristics of that person in connection with the person who has passed away, the deceased. So the survivor, the surviving person, he has rights to the inheritance due to the certain attributes and characteristics that person possesses. Now, when these rights and attributes are no longer held, the haqq will no longer be established. The haqq will no longer be present. And that's why you can't transfer this, because it's meaningless to transfer such huquq. The haqq is only established for particular people due to particular reasons. And so when you transfer this, if you were to transfer this right to a third party and sell this right, it loses its meaning, because this haqq, the Sharia has established its right for particular people only. So this haqq only exists whilst it's being deployed, used, or connected to the particular person. When it's traded, it loses existence and meaning, because the characteristics with which it exists and rests upon are no longer there. And that's why you can't trade this. However, it is permissible to settle and take compensation for this right. So an example is a person, he has the right of qisas, or a family member, a family member has been killed, and you have the right of retribution, and you can demand that qisas takes place, which is that the person is, this capital punishment that takes place against the murderer. But you are happy to do sulh, where you say, look, we'll take blood money instead, or we'll take a payment instead of this. So you are foregoing and overlooking your right. You can do that, but you can't trade this right. You can't then say to somebody else, oh, okay, I'll sell this right of having qisas done upon this individual if you pay me X amount. The only thing you can do is take compensation or agree on a settlement, sulh. And that will be permissible. When you agree on settlement, you're doing isqat. And when this isqat, you are foregoing your right then to execute and to practice upon this right. So you can no longer exercise the right that you have, because you've done isqat. You've dropped your right. You have foregone your right by accepting a payment. So Huquq Shari'ah of two types, Huquq Daruriyah and Huquq Asliya. Huquq Asliya you can take a payment for, meaning, but it's not a sale, rather it's purely a settlement where you step down from exercising your right and you're taking a settlement payment only. But it's not a sale. Your haqq is not being transferred to anybody. You are being paid for isqat, which is foregoing, stepping down from the ability to exercise the right that you have. Yes, huquq shar'iyah. Then you have al-huquq al-urfiyah. Huquq al-urfiyah refers to rights which are one of two. That the haqq is established in urf and it's not clashing against Shari'i principles. So it's something which is traded in urf, in customary practice, or it's a right which the customary practice has accepted. And that can be traded or anything. It's a right that's been accepted. It's not a right which is in the Sharia, but it's a right in urf. Now, in most of these cases, if there's a urf of it being tradable, it'll be tradable. So if that urf is now something which is traded, because it's established by urf, and the urf is that it's traded amongst people, then that because of the urf, it can be traded as long as it's not contradicting Sharia principles. The second type of urf, or huquq urfiyah, are those rights in huquq which are established by urf again, but they are opposing Sharia. So the conditions of urf are not found. So although it may be, some may argue this is urf, but because it's not a valid urf, it will not be considered for an urf in Sharia, and therefore it will not be something which can be paid for or traded. So not everything which is in urf is acceptable. There are certain conditions for urf to be accepted. So that is so this is everything that we need to know about urf or huquq. The huquq are simply rights. Those rights, the reason why the Sharia has not considered them to be amwal. So in Hanafi fiqh, huquq are not mal. Huquq which are not traded, and these huquq which are like this huquq shar'iyah that we discussed, it will not be mal, because huquq shar'iyah, they're not traded. It's not something which is muddakhar either. It's not ma yamiru tabul insan. It's purely something which Sharia has established from the outside for the person, or out of darura or out of asala. And a person only does isqat of those huquq, their haqq in that sense. They're not muddakhar, they don't have independent existence. They're just a right with the person who has the right. So it's not like mal, which can be traded and moved from one person to the other. Huquq remains with the person who has the authority and right, the sultan. And therefore the person grants you the right, or he doesn't grant you the right. That's why if I have huquq asliya, which is this idea of qisas and haqul irth, I have the right with me. Sharia has given me this right. It's in my conscience. I have this right with me. I can simply exercise it, or I can not exercise. If I decide not to exercise, I take a payment in lieu of it. I have simply just stepped down from my right in my authority, but I've not made a transfer to anybody else. That's why this haqq is not the same as mal. Because if it's something which is mal, it'll be existing independently. I can transfer that to other people. But up here, it's not nothing that's being transferred. Rather, it's just something in my conscience which I'm choosing not to do, and that's why it's a haqq. However, when it comes to huquq urfiyah, when something becomes tradable, and therefore when something it's now recognized as something which exists, it's now recognized as something which can be stored, it can be retrieved. There's a system that's been created for it, and the urf is not against Sharia. Then that huquq will be in the hukm of mal. It'll be legally considered to be in the hukm of amwal, because it's being treated as mal. So although min haythul mahiyya, it's not mal, but bi'itibar al-atharat wa-thamarat, considering its consequences and its outcomes will be deemed to be mal hukman, and it will be in the ruling of mal, because it'll be traded, and it'll also gain some form of iddikhar as a consequence, because this, there'll be a need to store this, retrieve this, or have some kind of methodology and system to capture this haqq. Although the real haqq will be in the conscience, but it'll be reflected on some paper or some documentation or some entry on a ledger somewhere. And then the connection between that and the conscience becomes strong, because it becomes tradable as a result. And so this is how huquq and the discussion of huquq are perceived or discussed among scholars. And that's why here in al-Durr al-Mukhtar, he's discussing this idea of huquq. So he mentions لا يجوز الاعتياض عن الحقوق المجردة كحق الشفعة. You can't take a payment, as we mentioned, for حق الشفعة, which is حقوق مجرد, right? It's حق المجرد. You can't take a payment for this. وعلى هذا لا يجوز الاعتياض عن الوظائف بالأوقاف. وفي آخر بحث تعارض العرف مع اللغة المذهب عدم اعتبار العرف الخاص، لكن أفتى كثير باعتباره وعليه فيفتى بجواز النزول عن الوظائف بمال. This is referring to some roles which were, it was like a stipend given for roles within awqaf. So a role of an imam, a role of being a teacher, mu'adhin, or being a lecturer somewhere, any role which was connected to payments and stipends from the awqaf. The discussion was, and the question which came about in earlier times was, can a person step down from their role and receive compensation from somebody else? So if there's Ahmed, for example, who's receiving a stipend of £1,000 a month for being a part-time lecturer somewhere, and he decides that I'll step down because somebody's offering him £3,000 for this right. So you transfer this right to me, and I'll give you £3,000 compensation. Or you step down from this role, and I'll give you £3,000 as a settlement, rather than saying transfer of this right. It's a haqq. You're saying that you'll step down from your haqq and you'll make space for somebody else, and somebody else can come and lecture this person who's paying him 3,000. Now, if Ahmad agrees, classically the fuqaha said it's la yajuz. But then later on, because of urf, this started happening. That's why the scholars allowed this to happen. That you can then step down and take a settlement fee, because the urf, it was something which became acceptable in urf, to take a settlement fee, to step down from your role and to let another person occupy that role. And you step down and you take compensation for this. That compensation is not it's not a sale, rather it's i'tiyad. It's simply a compensation and a settlement fee for you to step down. And similarly, another issue that came about was this بلزوم خلو الحوانيت فليس يرى بالحانوت إخراجه ولا إجارتها لغيره ولو وقفا انتهى ملخصا. The other issue that came about was, if a person had what's known as khulu al-hanut hawanit, this referred to space a person had with a particular shop. So if a person had space for a shop or a store connected to land, now once that person has this, is it binding? Can you have this haqq? Can you pay for this haqq? And can you do nuzul from this? Right? Can you take, is this right recognized? So he mentions that this right is recognized now, because it's a haqq. There was an urf of this for making a payment for this particular haqq, and then to for the owner of that space to kind of step down from his right to lease this or to evict the owner of that space or this right from that particular space. This became something which was practiced in that time. So this right did have meaning. It became an urf, and that's why it became binding. Biluzumi khulu al-hawanit. It became binding and acceptable. And that's why the owner of the shop could no longer then evict or lease to somebody else, because the person who had the right, he had the right to do this. And therefore you had to respect, because this right was recognized then in Shari'ah, because of urf, because this khulu al-hawanit was not something, it's not a Shari'i urf. Sorry, it's not a Shari'i Huquq. Neither is it a Huquq which is established due to asala. So it has to be a Huquq which is based on urf, like this Huquq which is of wadha'if, bil-uqaf. These are Huquq based on urf. And because the urf recognized these Huquq, there was acceptance of its Huquq. And that's why we recognize them as binding. وفي معين المفتي للمصنف معزين والوالجية إمارة في أرض بيئت فإن بناء أو أشجارا جاز وإن كرابا أو قراء أنهار أو نحوه مما لم يكن ذلك بمال ولا بمعنى مال لم يجوز. From here now he'll just talk about another issue which we'll discuss next week going forward inshallah, where again similar, this idea of a right being connected to property and a right not being connected to property. What are the consequences of that? We end here. Inshallah we'll continue next week. Subhanallah bihamdihi subhanaka wa bihamdika.